This is the first video to provide a testing term explanation. It's the first and probably the biggest term of all, and it sets the scenes for everything that follows. Now, of course, I need to explain the word test. Test as a noun and test as a verb. And I'll talk a lot about testing, but testing is going to get its own video because there's a nuanced definition of testing, I think, we need to look at. Defining testing has challenged some of the best testing minds in the past 50 or so years. This is the first video with an explanation of a testing term in it. So I have to kind of start at the beginning, and the beginning starts for me in the early 90s, but the true beginning was earlier than that, of course. So I'm going to talk about testing as a verb and testing as a noun. What do we mean by these terms? Where do I start? I need to start with a little history. Now, the best known early book in the software testing library, if you like, when there were very few books on testing, was The Art of Software Testing by Glenn Myers from 1978. Now, I'm not going to dwell on any of these books at any length, but I just want to take the quotes directly out of the book. And what Glenn said was, testing is the process of executing a program with the intent of finding errors. Now, this definition dates from the days when testing and debugging were kind of merged in many people's view, because most testing was done by programmers, not independent testers, for example. So the goal of that statement and the goal of this book was to separate, to distinguish programming, testing and debugging, if you like, different activities, but also to focus the tester's mind on the real goal, which is to detect faults, to expose failures in software so that they can be diagnosed and resolved, usually by a programmer, someone else. So that was the focus back in 1978. Now, a little bit later, Boris Beisa, another one of the, if you like, pioneers of certainly writing books and teaching testing in a more systematic and sophisticated way, Boris spends a whole chapter in this book, 27 or 8 pages, not defining testing, but talking around what testing is and some of the nuanced kind of attributes of what he, in his view, was good testing was all about. And he came up with this kind of maybe like a maturity model, but it's like a thinking maturity model. You know, how do testers think? And he sort of starts with phase 0. There's no difference between testing and debugging. This is like the base state, which is not terribly good. The first phase is the purpose of testing is to show that the software works, which is a very naive attitude. And if you want to prove software works, that's relatively easy, but you're not really making that much progress in improving the software by doing that. Phase 2 is the purpose of testing is show that it doesn't work. And that is more focused on Glenn Myers' kind of idea of the purpose of testing is to locate errors. The next phase is the purpose of testing is not to prove anything, but to reduce the perceived risk of not working to an acceptable value. So, you know, this is, if you like, risk-based testing in a nutshell. Phase 4 is this kind of idealized world, I think, where testing is not an act. It's a mental discipline that results in low-risk software without much testing effort. And so what he's trying to suggest is there's no one definition of testing, because you need to figure out where you're at in this kind of maturity of your thinking. Another aspect that's worth mentioning is in the goals for testing are more than just finding bugs. And if you like, one of the key ideas that both Glenn Myers and Boris Beisa came up with was the process of test design, selecting things to test, is an excellent way of preventing bugs, because you find mistakes in requirements. And so you eliminate bugs by getting a requirement corrected, if you like. There's also one statement in the book that I like to use. He argues that a good threat is worth 1,000 tests. And by that, he means that if the testers are allowed to create any test they desire to flex the system under test, the developers realise that could be all manner of things that perhaps they would not normally take very seriously, but they have to take seriously. The threat of having very rigorous, strenuous testing to come means the developers have to take much more seriously things that they might not have regarded as important. So it's not a stick or a carrot, but it's kind of an encouragement to get the developers to work in a more systematic and error-free way, if you like. Now, the third book I want to talk about is Bill Hetzel's Complete Guide to Software Testing. Now, again, Bill was one of the pioneers, if you like, one of the early writers on testing, again, in a systematic way. And he basically edited the proceedings of the very first test conference in Chapel Hill in 1972. At any rate, I'm not going to talk about that, but his first definition was this: testing is the process of establishing confidence that a program or system does what it's supposed to do. It's kind of testing intends to demonstrate programs, systems meet requirements, if you like. And that was the first attempt to move the attention away from finding bugs alone into a more broader, does it do what it should do? Now, at the same time, what Bill suggested was there are many other purposes, goals for testing. And you can see that some of these are very familiar to you if you've ever been a tester. Checking programs against specification, finding bugs, determining user acceptability, ensuring a system is ready for use, and so on. And these are all familiar kind of goals for testing. There's a bit more to this in that what Bill did in the second edition, which is the edition I've got, is he changed his, if you like, theme a little bit and suggested that testing is any activity aimed at evaluating an attribute or capability of a program or system in determining that it meets its required results. So it's as much about demonstrating software meets requirements as evaluating any capability of a program or system. That is, I would read into that phrase, there's an exploratory aspect to this. Now, whether that is exploratory testing as you might know and love it, or it's just an activity where you're exploring requirements to understand what software should do, that process is part of the testing game. So although Bill doesn't mention bugs and locating errors in this definition, you can see that the thinking in 83 was about a broader kind of range of goals than originally. Now, he also talks about quality because in the 80s, quality was a big buzzword in the IT community. Quality improvement initiatives were everywhere. They were rampant. It seemed to be flavour of the month. And so he talks about quality and what's the relationship between testing and quality. So if you take a definition of quality as quality means meeting requirements, which clearly influenced his definition just above there, what he argues is that quality is not intangible. It's not some soft, fluffy thing. It's something that we can measure, we can count. And so the purpose of testing is to make quality visible. That is, we provide evidence of what a system can and cannot do, and that is your evidence of quality in an indirect way. And as a goal, we should think of testing is the measurement of software quality. Now, that's easier said than done, but the spirit is there, if you like, in terms of the direction of travel of these definitions. Now, Kemkana, Folk, and I think it's Huen, forgive me for mispronouncing, but testing computer software was basically, I think Kemkana was the lead author in this. It's first edition 88, the second edition 93. He reverts back to the purpose of testing a program is to find problems in it, the whole idea of locating errors. So this is 10 and 15 years later than Glenn Myers and basically restating that original purpose. Now, I think what's interesting about this book is in the mid-80s, the role of PCs in IT really took off. Businesses started to recognise PCs as more than toys, and they became business tools as well. And obviously a lot of software was written for PCs to do all sorts of remarkable things, let's say. So the Testing Computer Software book seems to be kind of more focused on testing software on PCs and mainframes, which is kind of what driven a lot of the thinking and writing before the mid-80s. Now, in 2002, my good friend Neil Thompson and I wrote a book called Risk-Based E-Business Testing. At the time, testing the internet, testing websites was kind of relatively immature. There was lots of new terminology, technical terminology flying around. So there were lots of new kind of techniques, if you like, required to be created in order to implement, let's say, more systematic testing. So naturally, we created a glossary of terms in the back of the book. And our definition for test was another variant. We said a controlled exercise having potentially several objectives, including detection of faults, risk measurement, and confidence building. So it's a mix of goals. Now, this is no surprise, although it's a compact definition, it hints at testing having many possible goals. And that's kind of where we were about 20 years ago. Now, of course, risk-based testing had been talked about, but again, not really very well defined by people other than in a kind of a qualitative way. Now, in the book, we tried to focus people's attention much more on risk to identify them explicitly and then use that explicit definition of a risk to drive test objectives and test ideas and test cases, test scenarios and so on. Now, 2013, Ken produced another book with Rebecca Fielder, which is a training kind of book. This book is Foundations of Software Testing. And what's included in there is a notion of testing to learn about the product, the system under test, if you like. So every test is an experiment. So we're moving more towards a more, if you like, scientific method kind of concept of creating controlled experiments to evaluate the behaviour, performance, capabilities of products. More importantly, I think to me, is like we run these experiments on behalf of stakeholders. That is, we're running tests to explore a product, to provide information to stakeholders, and the stakeholders are going to make a decision. And this notion of testing being an information service, not just an activity you apply to software with no deliverable. The deliverable, the really valuable deliverable, is the information we gather as we explore and test. So the definition that Ken proposes is this idea of software testing as an empirical technical investigation conducted to provide stakeholders with information about the quality of the product or service under test. Now, the other important angle that I think is worth dropping in here is one of the other statements that is made in that book is, however you define quality, let's say, the definition that they chose was Jerry Weinberg's. Quality is value to some person. And so the implication is that quality is subjective. So different stakeholders will have different perceptions of quality of the same product. So potentially they're looking at things from different perspectives, and the tester has to understand and take a perspective on behalf of those stakeholders. Testers look for different things for different stakeholders. So not only does testing have different goals, it also might have different objectives, different goals for different perspectives, for different stakeholders. So stakeholders are becoming much more important in terms of the understanding of the scope and direction of testing. CAM again provides a long list of things that testing can do in terms of its search for information, bugs, assessing conformance to specs, and so on. Now, in the glossary that I've created, the Merge Glossary, how many terms in the glossary end in the word testing? I wonder how many you think that would be. 10, 20, 50? This is the list lifted directly from the database. There are 158 variations of the phrase with testing at the end. Now, these different phrases represent types or categories of testing. Some of them are talking about test design techniques. Some of them are more the human approach, pair testing, if you like. And we have this kind of challenge of having to define a word, testing, or you could substitute the word test in every one of these phrases. We have a challenge of defining test and testing in a way that makes it appropriate for every one of these 158 different terms that each have a unique definition. So the only way of achieving that, I think, is to look at the definition in a kind of a different way. We have to take a context-free definition that isn't going to influence in an adverse way any of these, if you like, refinements to the word test, to the word testing, that imply types of testing, categories of testing, test techniques, and so on. So in 2009, I wrote a little pocketbook, a summary of thinking of testing at the time, and I chose to use the definition, having looked around for quite a while. I chose to use a definition from the American Heritage Dictionary, and this is one of the alternative definitions. Of course, dictionaries provide multiple definitions all the time. Procedure for critical evaluation, a means of determining the presence, quality, or truth of something, a trial. So there are three kind of aspects to the definition of the noun test. So let me just walk through those three variations, because it gives us the flexibility to capture the spirit of what it means to be a test. All three taken together give us the foundations we need, and that's the way I look at it. So procedure for critical evaluation. What do we make of this? Well, critical evaluation involves a skillful judgment as to the truth or merit of something. So a test is often a procedure, and usually when we test, we might be following a script. That's possible, of course, but we might also be exploring in an improvisational way. At any rate, we have to do things in certain sequences, and in order to replicate a failure, we have to follow the same sequence naturally. But by calling it a procedure, it's a natural series of steps that include, let's say, preparation, execution of the test, results gathering potentially, some analysis and interpretation. There's a whole series of activities that we have to go through to do it systematically, this thing we call testing. Now, it doesn't necessarily require documentation, although many tests are documented. I'm not really worried about whether we document or not. It's the thought process. That is, the important thing to think about here is there is a perspicacious thought process. I love that word. The thought process is driven by the need to evaluate the system of a test with respect to its adequacy, consistency, behaviour, accuracy, reliability, or any other significant aspects or property. That's the game we're in. Now, the second aspect is it's a means of determining the presence, quality, or truth of something. Well, what does that kind of mean? Well, a test could determine the presence or absence of something. But when we look at quality, that's a different matter. The term itself is loaded with kind of emotional connotations in some respect. But we're rescued by the dictionary, I think, because if you look at the definition of quality, a quality could be an essential or distinctive characteristic, or a property, or an attribute. So it becomes a thing, not just a feeling, if you like. So a test could reveal or measure these properties. Can a test determine the truth of something? Well, yes. And the way we think in those terms is We test assertions. That is, we could assert this system meets some requirement in some way. And we can create some tests and run those tests to demonstrate the system meeting that requirement in some way. Maybe the assertion is the system behaves correctly, whatever correctly means, under certain conditions. And we can do that. We can demonstrate through testing that it does or it does not. Now, although this notion of testing assertions is simple on paper, we deal with fallible information all the time. And sometimes, perhaps often, maybe always, we have to do a lot of subjective judgment. For example, we cannot possibly define in all respects the behaviour of our systems in every detail, in every potential permutation of inputs and stimulants and so on. So because of that, there's always some interpretation required on what is a bug and what is not a bug, because if the requirement doesn't mention a behaviour and we encounter a behaviour in testing and we don't recognise it as something it should or should not do, what do? We have to have a conversation with stakeholders to understand, what does this test tell us? What does it mean? Now, one of the notions of a test is it's kind of a trial. And testing a system will help us to evaluate it in one or many ways. Now, the purpose of such an evaluation is normally to make a decision. So what we do is we test on behalf of stakeholders who have to make some important decisions. So these decisions could be to accept or reject the system. It could be for a programmer as a stakeholder to expose its shortcomings, so the shortcomings can be remedied. It may be that we discover things that mean that we have to rethink the design of a component or maybe the whole system. It may be that we expose information that means we need to relax a requirement or change a requirement or drop a requirement for the system. It may be that we have to scrap a component and start again. Or it may be that we really ought to buy an off-the-shelf component rather than try and build it ourselves because we don't have the capabilities. So a natural way of looking at a system under test is that it's on trial and it will be judged in some way. Now, we've looked at test the noun. Well, test the verb is kind of, I'm just going to use the same language and to give you this, offer you this definition: to critically evaluate, to determine the presence, quality or truth of something, to conduct a trial. And that is what we do when we test. Now, what about testing? Well, testing could use the same definition as of test the verb. But I want to suggest that testing is much more than running tests. The implication of the definitions of test the noun and test the verb are it's about running tests. But tests need preparation. And before preparation, there's some exploration and analysis, test design, and so on and so forth. A whole lot of other activities are required. And there's also, going back to the earlier comments on test design being an effective way of preventing bugs, there's a contribution that testing makes above and beyond just finding bugs, needless to say. So I think testing, the definition of testing as opposed to a test, the noun or the verb, is that testing needs its own explanation. It's a bigger game. So I'm going to have to create another video just to describe testing.